The dining room felt heavier than usual that October evening. Riley Nelson sat at the mahogany table that had hosted countless family dinners over the past 32 years, her fingers tracing the familiar grain of the wood. At 71, she still maintained the graceful posture that had caught Marcus's attention all those decades ago, though grief had carved new lines around her blue eyes. It had been exactly 10 days since they'd buried her husband of 32 years, and the emptiness where he used to sit seemed to grow larger with each passing meal. Derek, her 43-year-old son, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding his mother's gaze. His wife Stephanie sat rigidly beside him, her manicured fingers drumming against her wineglass with barely contained impatience. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock Marcus had restored years ago. "The service was beautiful, wasn't it?" Riley offered, trying to bridge the uncomfortable quiet. "Your father would have loved seeing so many people there. Mr. Patterson from the hardware store told me Marcus once helped him rebuild his entire porch for free when business was slow." Stephanie set down her fork with deliberate precision, the sound sharp against the china. "That's actually what we need to discuss with you, Riley." Her voice carried that particular tone she used when delivering ultimatums, sweet on the surface but cold underneath. Riley felt her stomach tighten. She looked between her son and daughter-in-law, searching for any warmth in their expressions. Derek was studying his plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe, while Stephanie had assumed her familiar posture of false concern. "What do you mean?" Riley asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Stephanie straightened in her chair, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the casual family dinner setting. "Derek and I have been talking extensively about your situation. This house is going to be far too much for you to handle alone." The words hit Riley like a physical blow. "Too much. I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet." "That's exactly the problem," Stephanie continued, her mask of pleasantness beginning to slip. "You're 71 years old, Riley. The maintenance alone will be overwhelming. Not to mention the property taxes, utilities, and general upkeep. It's simply not practical." Derek finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. "Mom, Stephanie's right. Without Dad's income from the construction business, you'll struggle to afford everything. The house is just too big for one person." Riley stared at her son, this man she'd raised, who'd once crawled into her lap during thunderstorms and promised he'd always take care of her. "I'm not helpless. Derek, your father and I saved carefully. We planned for this." "Saved what?" Stephanie's voice sharpened. "Riley, be realistic. Marcus's construction business barely broke even in his final years. The sale barely covered his debts. There's no substantial inheritance here." The casual dismissal of her husband's life's work stung more than Riley had expected. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "We think you should look into Sunset Manor," Stephanie said, naming the senior living facility on the outskirts of town. "It's a lovely place with activities and people your own age. You'd have built-in companionship and medical care if needed. No more worrying about burst pipes or lawn maintenance." Riley turned to Derek desperately. "You really think I should sell the house where you grew up, where your father and I built our entire life together?" Derek's response came too quickly, as if rehearsed. "It makes sense, Mom, and honestly, Stephanie and I could really use the space. We've been trying to start a family, and this house has so much potential for renovations." The meaning behind his words crashed over her like ice water. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her home. The home where she'd nursed Derek through chickenpox, where she'd taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, where she and Marcus had slow danced in the kitchen on their anniversary every year. Riley's hands began to tremble slightly. She set down her water glass carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I see. And how long am I supposed to take to arrange all this?" 2 weeks should be plenty of time," Stephanie said briskly, as if discussing a grocery run rather than dismantling a lifetime. That gives you time to tour Sunset Manor, arrange for movers, and sort through your belongings. I can recommend an estate sale company that handles everything." 2 weeks, Riley repeated numbly. Derek looked up then, and what she saw in his eyes was somehow worse than anger or hatred. It was indifference, complete, casual indifference to her pain. "It's for the best, Mom. You'll see. You'll be much happier with people your own age." Riley stood slowly, her legs unsteady. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the foundation of everything she'd believed about her family had shifted beneath her feet. "I need some time to think about this." "Of course," Stephanie said, though her tone suggested the thinking was merely a formality. "But Riley, please don't drag this out. It's harder on everyone when these transitions take too long." Riley walked upstairs to the bedroom she'd shared with Marcus, each step feeling like she was climbing a mountain. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, and his reading glasses remained on the nightstand where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. She sat on the edge of their bed and stared at her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back seemed older than 71, her silver hair limp and her eyes dulled by shock and grief. In 2 weeks, she would have to leave this room where she'd said goodbye to Marcus just 10 days ago. She would have to pack up 32 years of marriage into boxes and surrender it all to a son who'd just told her she was merely an inconvenience to be managed. But as she sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock, a small, hard kernel of determination. Marcus had always handled their finances, but he'd taught her to be thorough, to pay attention to details. Tomorrow, she would start making calls. She would understand exactly what she was entitled to, because something about Derek's casual dismissal of his father's business success didn't feel right. If they thought they could simply erase her from this family without consequence, they might be in for a surprise. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as Riley sat alone at the breakfast table, nursing her second cup of coffee. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Derek and Stephanie had already been by the previous evening to assess the space, measuring rooms and discussing paint colors as if she were invisible. Riley had spent a restless night thinking about Marcus and their financial arrangements. He'd always been protective of their money matters, handling everything himself while she managed the household. Now she wished she'd paid more attention to the details. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through familiar streets. Riley had been making the same drive for over 20 years, usually with Marcus handling their banking business while she waited in the car or ran other errands. He'd always said it was one less thing for her to worry about. Now she realized how dependent that had made her. Helen Martinez, the bank manager, greeted Riley with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. At 45, Helen had worked at the bank for 15 years and had known Marcus personally. "Mrs. Nelson, I was so sorry to hear about Marcus. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my children's school activities." "Thank you, Helen. He spoke fondly of you, too." Riley settled into the chair across from Helen's desk, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. "I need to understand my financial situation. Marcus handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost." Helen's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts." She turned to her computer, fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Is something wrong?" Riley's heart jumped. "Not wrong. Exactly. It's just, there are quite a few accounts here. More than I was expecting for a standard checking and savings setup." Helen printed out a statement and slid it across the desk. "Let me start with the joint checking account you and Marcus used for household expenses." Riley studied the numbers. The balance was modest but comfortable, enough to cover her expenses for several months if she was careful. Relief flooded through her. "Now," Helen continued, "there's also the joint savings account." Another sheet appeared. This balance was significantly larger, enough to sustain her for years if necessary. "That's wonderful," Riley said, feeling some tension leave her shoulders. Marcus was always careful about saving. "Yes, he was very methodical." Helen was still frowning at her screen. "But Mrs. Nelson, I'm seeing several other accounts here that I need to verify. Some appear to be in your name only." Riley blinked in confusion. "My name only? That doesn't sound right. Marcus managed all our finances." Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again. "According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts, 2 certificates of deposit, a money market account, and—" She paused. "This is interesting. A trust account that was established 5 years ago." Riley's head began to spin. "I don't understand. Marcus never mentioned any of this to me." "May I ask," Helen said carefully, "did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation? Sometimes clients establish separate accounts as a form of protection." The question caught Riley off guard. "Protection from what? I'm not sure what you mean." Helen hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes when clients have complex family dynamics, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes or external pressures, they take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security." Riley thought about Marcus's behavior over the past few years, how he'd started asking pointed questions about Derek's job stability, how he'd grown quiet whenever their son mentioned financial struggles, how he'd insisted on handling all their banking personally, never allowing Derek to accompany him even when their son had offered to help. "Can you tell me about these other accounts?" Riley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. "The first CD has been rolling over annually for 7 years. The second was opened 3 years ago. The money market account has been receiving automatic transfers from your joint checking account, small amounts, $50 here and there. But over time—" She handed Riley the statements. The numbers seemed to swim in front of her eyes. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial amounts of money, enough to live comfortably for decades. "How is this possible?" Riley asked. "I never signed anything. I never—" "Actually, you did," Helen said gently, pulling out a file folder. "Your signatures are on all the paperwork. It appears Marcus brought you in to sign documents multiple times over the years, probably telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance forms." Riley stared at the papers Helen showed her. There was her signature, dated and witnessed, on forms she didn't remember signing. But looking at the dates, she could place some of them. The day they'd come in to update their address after the city had renumbered their street. The time they'd switched to a new type of checking account. "He never told me what I was really signing," Riley whispered. "It's not uncommon," Helen said carefully. "Some spouses prefer to handle the financial details to avoid causing stress or confusion. And legally, everything is above board. These accounts are legitimately yours." Riley tried to process what this meant. While Derek and Stephanie were measuring her kitchen and planning their renovations, while they were treating her like a burden to be disposed of, she had resources they knew nothing about. "There's one more thing," Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. "The trust account I mentioned, it's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years, the Nelson Construction Trust. I believe that was your husband's company." "Yes, but Marcus sold the business when he retired. Derek said the money from the sale was barely enough to pay off debts." Helen consulted her screen again. "According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and then transfers to your trust account, Mrs. Nelson. I think you need to speak with the business accountant. There may be more to your financial picture than you realize." Riley left the bank in a daze, her purse heavy with account statements and printouts. Instead of driving straight home, she pulled into the parking lot of Miller's coffee shop and sat in her car. reading through everything Helen had given her. The numbers didn't lie. Somehow, without her knowledge, Marcus had been systematically protecting her. Every account, every investment, every trust fund was structured to ensure she would be financially independent. As she studied the trust account statements, a pattern emerged. The deposits corresponded with Derek's visits over the past 5 years, always larger amounts after Derek had mentioned financial difficulties or when Stephanie had hinted about their struggles with credit card debt. Marcus had been giving their son money, but he'd been protecting an equal or greater amount for her, as if he'd known that someday she might need to stand on her own. Her phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Mom, Stephanie found a great realtor who specializes in quick sales. We can start showing the house next week. Hope you're making progress on finding a place at Sunset Manor." Riley stared at the message for a long moment, then looked again at the bank statements in her lap. Derek and Stephanie were so confident, so certain they held all the cards. They had no idea that their careful plans were built on a foundation they didn't understand. Tomorrow, she would call Patricia Williams, the accountant who'd handled Nelson Construction's books for years. She would find out exactly what else Marcus had left behind. And then she would decide what to do with the knowledge that her husband had loved her enough to ensure she'd never be at anyone's mercy. The grief was still there, as fresh and sharp as ever. But underneath it, something else was growing. A quiet strength she hadn't felt in years. The accounting office of Williams & Associates occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, between a used bookstore and an antique shop. Riley had never been here before. Marcus had always handled the business meetings himself. Claiming the financial details would only give her a headache. Now she understood he'd been protecting her from more than just tedium. Patricia Williams looked to be in her early 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been handling Nelson Construction's books for over 12 years, and her expression when Riley had called yesterday had been carefully professional but warm. "Mrs. Nelson," Patricia said, gesturing to a chair across from her cluttered desk. "First, let me offer my condolences. Marcus was a good man and an honest businessman. I'm going to miss our quarterly meetings." "Thank you. I wish I could say I knew him as well in business as you did." Riley settled into the chair, her bank statements tucked safely in her purse. "I'm trying to understand our financial situation, and the bank mentioned ongoing business income that I wasn't aware of." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "You weren't aware? That's unusual. Marcus spoke about you often, and I assumed you were involved in the major financial decisions. Please, I need to understand what's been happening. My son tells me the business was sold years ago and barely covered its debts." "Sold?" Patricia looked genuinely confused. "Mrs. Nelson, Nelson Construction wasn't sold. It was restructured." She turned to her computer, pulling up files. 5 years ago, Marcus transferred ownership of the company assets into a trust, the Nelson Construction Trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "I'm the owner of the construction company. Well, the trust owns it, and you own the trust. It's been quite successful. Actually, your husband was very careful about the contracts he accepted after the restructuring. Smaller jobs, reliable clients, steady income rather than the boom and bust cycle of larger commercial projects." Patricia printed out several pages and handed them to Riley. "These are the profit and loss statements for the past 5 years. As you can see, the company has been generating consistent revenue." Riley stared at the numbers, her hands trembling slightly. The annual profits were substantial, more than enough to explain the regular deposits she'd seen in the trust account statements. "But Marcus retired," Riley said weakly. "He wasn't working anymore. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations. Yes, but he maintained oversight and handled the larger strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Jake Morrison." "I believe you know him," Riley nodded. Jake had worked for Marcus for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and working his way up to foreman. He'd been at the funeral, one of the few people there who'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken rather than merely polite. "Jake has been essentially running the company for the past 5 years," Patricia continued. "Marcus structured it so that Jake receives a percentage of the profits as a performance bonus, which has kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement." "Why didn't Marcus tell me any of this?" The question came out as barely a whisper. Patricia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Nelson, this might not be my place to say, but Marcus was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that Derek had been struggling financially and that his wife had expensive tastes. Marcus worried that if the family knew about the continued business income, there would be expectations and demands that might compromise your future security." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Every time Derek had asked his father for help, every time Stephanie had made comments about how comfortable Riley and Marcus seemed compared to their own struggles, Marcus had been calculating how to help their son without sacrificing Riley's future independence. "He was protecting me," Riley said, the words heavy with realization. "He was protecting both of you, in different ways," Patricia said gently. "The loans he made to Derek over the years were substantial, but they came from the business operating account, not from your personal assets. And he was very careful to document everything properly." She pulled out another file folder. "These are copies of all the loan agreements between the business and your son. Marcus insisted on treating them as formal business transactions with payment schedules and interest rates." Riley opened the folder with shaking hands, page after page of loan documents, each one signed by both Marcus and Derek. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, supposedly for Derek's various business ventures and investments that never seemed to materialize. "Has Derek been making payments on these loans?" Riley asked, though she already suspected the answer. Patricia's expression grew uncomfortable. "The payment schedule shows significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $95,000. The number hit Riley like a physical blow. Derek owed the family business, her business, nearly $100,000, while simultaneously claiming his father had left nothing but debts. "What happens to these loan obligations now?" Riley asked. "They transfer with the business assets. As the new owner of the trust, you have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit." Riley thought about Derek and Stephanie measuring her kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could start showing the house. They were so confident, so certain they deserved everything Marcus had built. "There's one more thing you should know," Patricia said, her voice even more careful now. "Last month, your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's passing, he'd be taking over management of the business affairs. He asked me to prepare transfer of ownership documents." Riley's breath caught. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I'd need written authorization from the trust beneficiary, from you. He seemed quite surprised that you were involved in the business structure at all." So Derek had been planning to claim the business along with the house. Assuming she was too grief-stricken and naive to understand what was happening, the betrayal cut deeper than she'd thought possible. "Patricia, I need to ask you something confidentially," Riley said. "If I wanted to maintain the current business structure with Jake continuing to manage operations, would that be feasible?" "Absolutely. Jake has been hoping to hear from you. Actually, he's concerned about the company's future and his own job security. If you're willing to maintain the status quo, I think you'd find him very reliable and grateful for the opportunity to continue." Riley gathered up all the papers, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd learned. The business was hers. The substantial debt Derek had accumulated was real and legally enforceable. and neither he nor Stephanie had any idea that their plans were built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with Jake as soon as possible," Riley said. "And I want to understand all of my options regarding the outstanding loans." "Of course. Shall I call Jake this afternoon?" "Yes, please. And Patricia, I'd appreciate it if this conversation remained confidential for now." "Absolutely. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business." As Riley drove home, her phone buzzed with another text from Stephanie. "Riley, the realtor wants to schedule a photographer for tomorrow afternoon. Please make sure the house is clean and decluttered. First impressions matter for potential buyers." Riley stared at the message for a long moment before tucking her phone away without responding. Let them plan their photography session. Let them imagine their future in her house, spending money they thought they'd inherited. They had no idea that the foundation they were building their dreams on was about to crumble beneath them. That evening, Riley sat in Marcus's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by his carefully organized files. Now she understood why he'd been so meticulous about record-keeping, why he'd insisted on proper documentation for every transaction. He'd been building a fortress around her, brick by brick, transaction by transaction, and tomorrow, she would start learning how strong those walls really were. Jake Morrison's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as they sat in Riley's kitchen the next morning, at 55. He still had the broad shoulders and calloused palms of a man who'd spent his life building things, but his eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there at Marcus's funeral. "Mrs. Nelson, I've got to be honest with you," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been worried sick since Mr. Marcus passed. Derek came by the job site last week talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. It didn't sound good for folks like me." Riley poured herself another cup of coffee, using the familiar routine to steady her nerves. "Jake, what exactly did my son tell you? He said the family was going through the estate and that tough decisions would need to be made about the business. He wanted me to give him a complete list of all our current contracts, equipment values, and cash flow projections." Jake's jaw tightened. "He also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the main office. And what did you tell him? That I'd need to talk to whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. Marcus always told me that if anything happened to him, I should wait for proper instructions from the legal owner." Jake met her eyes directly. He never said it would be Derek. Relief flooded through Riley. Marcus had prepared for this scenario, ensuring that Jake would be a guardian of the business rather than simply handing it over to anyone who claimed authority. "Jake, I need to share something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us for now." His expression grew serious. "You have it, ma'am." Riley spread out the documents Patricia had given her the day before. "I own Nelson Construction. Not Derek. Not the estate. Me. Marcus transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago. And I'm the beneficiary." Jake's eyes widened as he studied the papers. "Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. Marcus was always thinking 3 steps ahead." "He was indeed. And according to these records, the business has been quite profitable under your management." A flush of pride crossed Jake's features. "We've built a good reputation. Mrs. Nelson, steady clients, quality work, fair prices. Mr. Marcus taught me that repeat customers are worth more than any single big score." "I want you to continue exactly as you have been," Riley said. "But I need to understand something. Derek has been less than honest about the family's financial situation. Can you tell me about any interactions you've had with him regarding business matters?" Jake's expression darkened. "There have been several over the years. He'd come around when Mr. Marcus wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know about upcoming payments from clients. A couple of times he suggested that maybe the business could help him out with some temporary funding for investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he'd need to talk to his father. I'm not stupid. Mrs. Nelson, I could see what was happening. Jake's voice grew harder. Last year, he actually showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a big payment from the Morrison office building project. Just a coincidence, he said, but he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about the deposit. Riley's stomach clenched. Derek had been monitoring the business income, probably trying to time his requests for loans to coincide with maximum available cash. Jake, I want to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Do you think Derek understands how much money has been flowing through this business? Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think he knows it's more than your family let on, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. Marcus was very careful about keeping business and personal finances separate, at least on paper. What do you mean? Well, your husband was smart about it. When Derek would ask for help, Mr. Marcus would tell him the business was struggling, that margins were tight. But then he'd find a way to help anyway. Usually as a loan from the business account rather than from his personal funds. Jake pulled out his own small notebook, worn from years of use. I keep track of everything, Mrs. Nelson. It's a habit Mr. Marcus taught me. According to my records, Derek has received payments totaling about $93,000 over the past 5 years. The number was even higher than what Patricia had shown her. Payments, not loans. That's what I mean about Mr. Marcus being smart. He'd structure them as loans on paper, with payment schedules and everything. But he never actually enforced the payment terms. Derek would miss a payment, and Mr. Marcus would just let it slide. So Derek thinks he owes nothing. Derek acts like he owes nothing. Jake corrected. Whether he really believes it or just pretends to believe it, I can't say. As if summoned by their conversation, Riley heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she could see Derek's Honda Pilot parked behind Jake's work truck. That's my son, Riley said quietly. I don't want him to know we've been talking about business matters. Jake nodded and quickly gathered up the papers she'd shown him. Mrs. Nelson, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support. Mr. Marcus was a good man, and he trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me. Derek walked in without knocking, something that would have irritated Marcus, but which Riley had learned to accept over the years. At 43, Derek still had the lean build of his youth, but stress had added lines around his eyes and a perpetual tension to his shoulders. Morning, Mom, he said, barely glancing at Jake. I wasn't expecting company. Jake stopped by to check on me, Riley said smoothly. You know how thoughtful he's always been. Right. Derek's attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the kitchen as if evaluating it for resale potential. Actually, Jake, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation. Jake's expression became carefully neutral. Oh, with Dad gone, there are going to be some changes. The family needs to make some practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations. Riley watched this exchange with fascination. Derek was so confident, so certain of his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that had never belonged to him. What kind of changes? Jake asked. Well, we'll need to evaluate whether it makes sense to continue operations, or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts. Derek's tone was casual, as if he were discussing what to have for lunch. I see. And who's making these decisions? Derek blinked, clearly not expecting the question. The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward. Will you now? Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Riley caught the slight emphasis on you. Mom, you might want to make some fresh coffee, Derek said. dismissing her as he always had when important conversations were taking place. "Jake and I need to discuss some technical details." But Riley didn't move. For the first time in years, she stood her ground. "I'll stay. Thank you. This is my kitchen, and Jake is my guest." Derek looked surprised but shrugged. "Fine, Jake. I'll need you to prepare a complete inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts so I can assess the financial situation." "I'd be happy to help with that," Jake said carefully. "Who should I coordinate with regarding authorization for account access?" "With me, obviously. And you have the legal authority to access Nelson Construction accounts because—" The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Derek's face was reddening, and Riley could see him struggling between irritation and uncertainty. "Look, Jake, I don't think you understand the situation here," Derek said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when he felt challenged. "This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and make sure everyone gets taken care of, but I can't do that if you're going to make things difficult." "I'm not trying to make things difficult," Jake replied evenly. "I'm just trying to understand who I'm supposed to be taking orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures and documentation." Derek turned to Riley, clearly expecting support. "Mom, explain to Jake that I'm handling Dad's business matters now." Riley looked at her son, this man who was planning to sell her house out from under her, who had accumulated nearly $100,000 in debt while claiming his father left nothing behind, and made her choice. "Actually, Derek, I think Jake is right to ask for proper documentation," she said quietly. "Your father was always very careful about these things." Derek stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about making sure everything is handled properly and legally. Surely you can understand the importance of that." For the first time since this conversation began, Derek looked uncertain, and watching that uncertainty creep across his features, Riley felt something she hadn't experienced in years: power. 3 days later, the confrontation Riley had been both dreading and anticipating finally came. Derek and Stephanie arrived at 7 in the morning, their faces grim with determination. They'd clearly spent the intervening time consulting with lawyers and planning their strategy. "We need to talk. Mom. Now." Derek's voice was tight with barely controlled anger as Riley opened the front door. "It's rather early, don't you think?" "This can't wait," Stephanie said, pushing past Riley into the living room. She clutched a manila folder like a weapon, her designer heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floors. They positioned themselves between Riley and the door, an intimidation tactic she recognized from years of watching Stephanie manage Derek. Both remained standing, creating a sense of urgency and dominance. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Derek began. "But Jake Morrison called yesterday and said he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization. What did you tell him?" Riley settled into Marcus's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. "I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that." "Proper procedures?" Stephanie's voice was shrill. "Derek is Marcus's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need?" "Legal authorization," Riley said calmly. "The kind that comes with actual ownership." Derek's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I handle all the assets until probate is settled." "Actually, Derek, that's not quite accurate." Riley reached for the folder she'd placed on the side table, the one containing all the documents Patricia Williams had given her. Derek and Stephanie both tensed as she opened it. "Your father's will does indeed leave his personal possessions in this house to the family." Riley continued, "But Nelson Construction isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 5 years." "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded. Riley pulled out the trust documents and set them on the coffee table between them. Nelson Construction has been owned by the Nelson Construction Trust since 2019. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. The silence that followed was deafening. Stephanie reached for the documents first, her manicured fingers shaking as she scanned the legal language. Derek read over her shoulder, his face growing pale. "This is impossible," Stephanie whispered. "You don't know anything about business. You never even balanced a checkbook." "You're right. I didn't. Your father handled all of that. But apparently, he understood things about our family situation that I was too naive to see." Derek sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. "But the business was struggling. Dad always said margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep operations running." "The business has been quite profitable. Actually," Riley handed him another set of papers. "Here are the financial statements for the past 5 years. Watching Derek's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. These profits. Derek's voice was barely audible. "Where did this money go?" "Some of it went to you. Derek, quite a lot of it. Actually," Riley pulled out the loan documentation. $95,000 over 5 years, to be precise. Stephanie grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. "These say loans. Derek, you told me those were gifts. You said your father was helping us get established." "They were gifts," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad never asked for payments. He never even mentioned payment schedules." "Actually, he did," Riley said quietly. "Patricia Williams has copies of every conversation. Every missed payment. Every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed." She watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Derek had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments based on money he thought was his. "But this doesn't change anything," Stephanie said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "The house still goes to Derek. That's worth more than some little construction business." "Is it?" Riley asked mildly. Stephanie's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. "Don't play games, Riley. This house is worth at least $400,000. "You're right. It's a lovely property." As Riley paused, watching their faces. "Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage." Derek looked up sharply. "What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off." "It was, but 18 months ago, your father took out a home equity loan, quite a substantial one. Actually," Riley pulled out the final set of documents, the ones she'd discovered in Marcus's study just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked Emergency Funds. "A home equity loan for $380,000, Riley continued. "The proceeds were transferred into the Nelson Construction Trust account, which means they became part of my inheritance." Stephanie's face went white. "That's not possible. We would have known. We would have had to sign." "Your father was the sole owner of the house at the time," Riley interrupted. "I was listed as a spouse with rights of survivorship, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature." Derek stared at those loan documents like they were written in a foreign language. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage the house just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this conversation began, Riley allowed her carefully controlled emotions to show. "Because he was protecting me, Derek. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security. Protecting you from what?" Derek's voice was hoarse. "From this," Riley said, gesturing to the scene in front of her. "From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved." Stephanie's composure finally cracked completely. "You manipulated him. You convinced a dying man to change everything. Your father wasn't dying when he set up these trusts. Stephanie, he was planning." And the fact that he felt the need to plan for this scenario should tell you something about how he viewed our family dynamics. Derek's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mom, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a construction business. And this house is our family home. It should stay in the family. It is staying in the family. Derek, it's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Stephanie said desperately. How will you afford the mortgage payments? The same way your father intended, with income from Nelson Construction. Jake Morrison assures me the business is quite stable, and Patricia Williams says the cash flow will easily cover the loan payments with plenty left over for my living expenses. Riley stood up, smoothing her dress. Now, I believe you mentioned something about moving out. I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Derek looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family means. Your father did do everything for me? Riley interrupted. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own son's. And now I understand just how much I needed that protection. Stephanie was already at the door, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, Riley. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, Riley said calmly. But you should know that everything your father did was completely legal and properly documented. Patricia Williams is very thorough, and she's already provided copies of all relevant documents to my attorney. Derek paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. I don't understand, Mom. Why are you doing this to us? Riley felt her heart break a little at the genuine pain in his voice. For a moment, she saw the little boy who used to run to her with scraped knees and bad dreams. But then she remembered the cold indifference in his eyes when he'd told her to pack her bags and leave. I'm not doing anything to you, Derek. I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me. After they left, Riley sat alone in the sudden quiet of her house, and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since she was a young woman, she was completely financially independent. She owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what she had, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been her relationship with her only child, and no amount of financial security could fill that void. As evening approached, Riley found herself standing in Marcus's study, surrounded by the evidence of his careful planning. On his desk, she noticed a sealed envelope with her name written in his familiar handwriting. Inside, she found a letter dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Riley, it began. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and you've discovered the truth about our family's situation. I pray that I'm wrong about Derek, that he'll step up and be the son we raised him to be. But if he doesn't, I want you to know that every decision I made was to ensure you'd never have to depend on anyone's kindness to survive. You are stronger than you know, more capable than you believe, and you deserve to live your life on your own terms. Don't let guilt or family obligations trap you in a situation that diminishes your worth. I love you enough to give you the power to save yourself, even from our own son if necessary. All my love, Marcus. Riley pressed the letter to her chest and wept. For Marcus, for Derek, for the family she'd thought she had, and for the woman she was finally becoming. 2 months after the confrontation, Riley sat in her lawyer's office reviewing settlement documents. James Patterson was a methodical man in his 60s who specialized in family disputes and had been recommended by Patricia Williams. His calm competence had been invaluable during the more stressful moments of the legal proceedings. How did they take the final terms? Riley asked, accepting the coffee his secretary had brought. James's expression suggested controlled amusement. About as well as you'd expect. Derek's attorney spent considerable time arguing that family obligations should supersede business contracts, but ultimately the law is quite clear on debt obligations. He handed Riley the settlement agreement. After 2 months of legal wrangling, Derek and Stephanie had agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt and established a payment plan that would take them 6 years to complete, assuming they never missed a payment. They tried once more to negotiate a family forgiveness clause. James continued, Derek actually broke down in the final meeting, claiming that you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money. And what did you tell them? I reminded them that I was representing your financial interests, not your family relationships. Though I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect legitimate debts. The settlement also included provisions that particularly satisfied Riley. If Derek and Stephanie defaulted on payments, the business could legally garnish Derek's wages and place liens on any property they purchased. It was a safety net that would ensure she received what was owed, regardless of their future financial decisions. More importantly, the agreement included an unexpected proposal that had come from Derek himself during the final negotiations. The rental arrangement was Derek's idea, Riley asked, rereading that section of the agreement. Completely. He approached us privately and asked if you'd consider renting them the upper floor of your house at market rates. He said, James consulted his notes, that he wanted to find a way to rebuild trust while meeting his financial obligations. Riley considered this carefully. The old Victorian house did have a separate entrance to the second floor, originally designed for Marcus's elderly mother before she'd decided to move to Arizona instead. Derek and Stephanie could have privacy while helping Riley with the mortgage payments that had been restructured as part of Marcus's careful planning. What about Stephanie? Was she supportive of this arrangement? Initially resistant, but she came around when she realized their other housing options with their current debt-to-income ratio. James's expression was diplomatically neutral. I believe the phrase Derek used was that she was willing to swallow her pride for the sake of their future. Riley signed the settlement agreement, including the rental clause. It felt like a small step towards something that might eventually resemble a family relationship again. 3 weeks later, as Riley was organizing Marcus's study, she discovered something that made her heart stop. Hidden behind a loose board in the back of his desk drawer was another envelope, this one containing a property deed and a set of keys. The deed was for a small cottage in Mendocino, purchased 3 years earlier through the Nelson Construction Trust. A note in Marcus's handwriting was attached, for Riley's retirement, when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. The cottage was a 40-minute drive north along the coast, nestled on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Riley drove up the following weekend with Jake Morrison, who'd insisted on checking the property's condition before she spent time there alone. Mr. Marcus always did think of everything, Jake said, as they walked through the beautifully maintained 2-bedroom cottage. He had me come up here quarterly to check on things, make sure the roof was sound and the pipes were working. I always wondered what he was planning. The cottage was perfect. Large windows facing the ocean, a cozy fireplace, and a kitchen designed for someone who enjoyed cooking for pleasure rather than obligation. The back deck offered an unobstructed view of the coastline, and Riley could imagine spending morning coffee there, watching the fog roll in and out. Mrs. Nelson, Jake said carefully, I hope you'll consider keeping the cottage and the main house. With the rental income from Derek and Stephanie, plus the business profits, you could easily afford both. And honestly, everyone deserves a place to escape to. Riley walked out to the deck and breathed in the salt air. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. 6 months later, Riley had settled into a rhythm that felt like the life she was meant to live. She spent 3 days a week at the cottage in Mendocino, 3 days at the main house, and 1 day traveling between them or handling business affairs. Derek and Stephanie had moved into the upstairs apartment and were making their monthly payments reliably. The arrangement was working better than anyone had expected. Derek had taken a second job and was contributing labor to Nelson construction projects on weekends to help pay down his debt faster. The dynamic between Riley and Stephanie remained cool but civil. But Derek was making genuine efforts to rebuild their relationship. He'd started joining Riley for coffee on Sunday mornings, tentatively sharing stories about his work and asking about her life at the cottage. "Mom," he said one Sunday, looking uncomfortable, "I need to tell you something." Riley set down her cup and waited. "Stephanie's pregnant." Derek's voice was barely above a whisper. "We found out last week." Riley felt her breath catch. "Derek, that's wonderful news. Is it?" He looked up at her with eyes that reminded her of the uncertain little boy he'd once been. "I mean, given everything that's happened, with our living situation and the debt, and I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it." For the first time since the confrontation months earlier, Riley reached across the table and took her son's hand. "I'm going to be a grandmother. Derek, how could I feel anything but joy about that?" Derek's eyes filled with tears. I was hoping maybe you could help us. Not financially," he added quickly, "but with advice, with experience." Stephanie's scared, and honestly, so am I. I don't want to mess this up the way I messed up everything else. Riley squeezed his hand. "Of course I'll help. That's what families do for each other." The irony wasn't lost on her. Derek was asking for the very support he'd tried to deny her months earlier. But watching her son struggle with genuine remorse and fear, Riley understood that some lessons could only be learned through consequences. "There's something else," Derek said. "Stephanie wants to apologize to you. She's been asking me to arrange it, but she's afraid you won't want to see her." Riley considered this carefully. Stephanie's behavior had been inexcusable, but pregnancy and financial stress could change people's perspectives dramatically. "Tell her I'll think about it," Riley said finally. "But Derek, any apology has to be genuine. I won't accept something that's just about making her feel better." The apology came 2 weeks later. When Stephanie knocked hesitantly on Riley's door one afternoon, she looked different, smaller somehow, with dark circles under her eyes and her usually perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Riley, could we talk, please?" They sat in the living room, the same space where the original ultimatum had been delivered months earlier. But this time, Stephanie perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I need to apologize," Stephanie began, her voice shaking slightly. "For everything I said, everything I did. There's no excuse for how I treated you." Riley waited, saying nothing. "I was scared." Stephanie continued. "Derek and I were drowning in debt, credit cards, student loans, medical bills from when I had that surgery last year. I thought if we could just get some financial breathing room, everything would be okay. But that didn't give me the right to try to throw you out of your own home." "No, it didn't," Riley said quietly. "When I found out about the pregnancy, I realized someday I'm going to be the older woman in the family. Someday I might need my children to take care of me. And if I treated my mother-in-law the way I treated you—" Stephanie's voice broke. "I don't want my children to learn that family members are disposable when they become inconvenient." Riley studied the younger woman's face, looking for signs of manipulation or false emotion, but all she saw was genuine regret and fear. "Stephanie, I appreciate your apology, but words are just the beginning. Rebuilding trust takes time and consistent actions. I know. Derek and I have been talking about it. We want to do better, not just with the money we owe you, but with being a real family. We were hoping—" Stephanie hesitated. "We were hoping you might consider being involved with the baby. Not as a babysitter," she added quickly, "but as a grandmother. Someone who could teach them about family history and values." Riley felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "I'd like that very much." Over the following months, Riley watched Derek and Stephanie slowly transform into responsible adults. The pregnancy had been a wake-up call for both of them. Derek worked 2 jobs without complaint, and Stephanie had taken on freelance graphic design work that she could do from home. They'd also started attending financial counseling sessions and had created a strict budget that allowed them to pay Riley's rent on time, while also addressing their other debts. Most importantly, they'd both begun treating Riley with the respect she deserved. Riley's grandson was born on a crisp March morning, 7 months after the confrontation that had nearly destroyed their family. She was in the delivery room when Thomas Marcus Nelson entered the world, screaming lustily and grasping his father's finger with tiny, determined hands. "Mom," Derek said, tears streaming down his face. "Would you like to hold your grandson?" Riley cradled the baby carefully, marveling at his perfect features and the way he seemed to calm at her voice. "Hello, Thomas. I'm your grandmother, and I have so many stories to tell you about your grandfather." Stephanie, exhausted but glowing, reached for Riley's hand. "Riley, Derek and I have been talking. We want you to be more than just a grandmother to Thomas. We want you to be his financial guardian if anything ever happens to us. Someone who'll make sure he's protected the way Marcus protected you." Riley looked between her son and daughter-in-law, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They were young and had made serious mistakes, but they were learning. More importantly, they were finally understanding what family really meant. "I'd be honored," Riley said softly. 1 year after Marcus's death, Riley stood on the deck of her Mendocino cottage, watching Derek push Thomas in a stroller along the beach below. Stephanie had stayed back at the main house, claiming she needed to catch up on work, but Riley suspected she was giving 3 generations of the Nelson family time to bond. Derek climbed up to the deck, carrying his son, both of them sandy and laughing. "Mom, I need to tell you something," Derek said, settling Thomas in his lap. "This year has been the hardest and the best of my life. Losing Dad, nearly losing you, having to face what I'd become. It almost broke me." Riley waited for him to continue. "But I understand now what Dad was trying to teach me. Love isn't just about being there for the good times. It's about making the hard choices that protect the people you care about, even when they don't understand or appreciate it." Derek looked down at his son, then back at his mother. "I want Thomas to grow up knowing that family means security, respect, and unconditional love, not just taking whatever you can get." Riley felt tears prick her eyes. "Your father would be so proud of the man you're becoming." "I hope so. And Mom, thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve your patience." As the sun set over the Pacific, 3 generations of the Nelson family sat together on the deck, each understanding their place in a legacy of love that had been tested but not broken. Riley thought about Marcus's letter, about his prediction that she was stronger than she knew. He'd been right, but he'd also given her something even more valuable than financial independence. He'd given her the power to demand the respect and love she deserved, and the wisdom to recognize when that respect was genuinely offered. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean's eternal rhythm and Thomas's sleepy babbling. Riley held her grandson while Derek dozed in his chair, finally understanding what true wealth looked like. It wasn't the money in her accounts or the property she owned. It was the knowledge that she'd fought for her own worth and won, and that she'd raised a son who was learning to do the same for his family. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Riley whispered a thank you to Marcus. Wherever he was, he'd loved her enough to ensure she'd never be helpless, and wise enough to know that sometimes the people we love most need to learn the hardest lessons. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and Riley sat in her own home, holding her own grandchild. Finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been hers by right. It meant peace, dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of a battle fought and won. But most of all, it meant that love, real love, sometimes requires the courage to say no, to demand better, and to trust that the people who truly care about you will rise to meet that challenge. As Thomas fell asleep in her arms and Derek stirred from his nap, Riley smiled. The Nelson family legacy would continue, but it would be built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation, understanding rather than assumption, and strength rather than surrender. And that, she thought, was exactly what Marcus had intended all along.